Do you want to know how to expand your short film into the full-length feature film? What about how you develop and write the feature script and create a pitch deck and budget to be able to pitch with? We'll cover all those things and more in this video, so let's dive in. Hey there, I'm Jordan and welcome back to my channel. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and essentially what filmmaking can teach us about life. I'm so excited to dive into the very last part of our multi-part video case study series on the making of my short film, Cuddle Buddies, that I wrote, directed, produced, and edited. Part 6. The Great Film Club local screenings. Perhaps one of the greatest promotional opportunities came when I met fellow filmmaker Sabrina Torres. She also goes by Sabrina the Great, and a couple years ago when I met her at a filmmaker meetup, it was the first time we met, and she was just telling me about her vision for this local film club that people could screen their short films, they could submit, and she would put it up and basically create a place where people could actually come together, celebrate independent film, and build a community. The idea for her film club was called the Great Film Club, and immediately I started telling her about Cuddle Buddies. Cut to about a month later after that initial discussion with Sabrina, and she was kind enough to program Cuddle Buddies in the upcoming short film Mike Night for that month to actually get the validation with fresh audiences and see it again with more and more people who were discovering it for the first time was so unbelievably validating. There's no better way to test your work than to do it on a big screen with an audience, and then especially to talk with people afterwards and see what they thought about it and get their reactions. So many people came up to me after and they just wanted to know more about professional cuddling, and that to me said a lot about how engaged the audience actually was with the film. They cared about Lucy, they cared about the cuddling, and they just kept wanting to know more, despite how many or how few festivals it ended up getting into. One of the other crucial components that came out of screening the film at so many local screenings was the fact that enough people started telling me they were interested in seeing more. They wanted to know where the story kept going after we cut to black at the end. And what that really told me was that there was a market and there was an audience for this film if we were to ever expand it into the feature version. And I think enough similar conversations like that over a matter of months became the key decision for me to actually decide to pursue the short as a feature. Part 7. A few more takeaways for marketing. As we talked about in the last installment, making sure to have a very specific and strategic online marketing campaign, especially for your social media platforms, is crucial. And the thing that is so important to do is to continue to keep updating these sites as you go. Even if the film has been out for a while, constantly keep people in the loop so that they are aware this thing is still happening. And it could just be one of those random posts that gets into the hands of the right person or somebody who knows the right person who maybe could help you take it to that next level. Part 8. Developing the short into the feature. Perhaps one of the most difficult challenges I've ever faced was the process of adapting the short film script for Cuddle Buddies into the full-length feature film on the page. It was one of those things where when I did the short film, I never really planned to do anything beyond just a short. And because of that, I didn't really ever have plans for a feature or to expand it. And I really thought it was gonna live and die by the short film. So now years later and still in the development process for the feature film version of Cuddle Buddies that I'm currently pitching. So shameless plug, if any of you out there know any potential investors, let me know. One of the things that I wish I would have done in hindsight is plan to actually make a feature when I was making the short all those years ago. And it probably would have been much easier, since if I had started with the feature on the larger canvas, then I could have taken a smaller chunk or maybe one scene from the feature and made that the short film. And so in that way, reverse engineering it sometimes is the name of the game if you even think that your short film might be playing on a larger scale. Part of the reason the adaptation from the short into the feature script was so difficult was I really felt like I had said everything I wanted to say from a thematic standpoint in the short. So when I went back to the drawing board and finally committed to doing the feature, I really had to sit down and think long and hard about what else I still wanted to say about the themes of connection, intimacy or lack thereof, cuddling as an industry, and Lucy's story as a character. Some of the conversations that I had with people at the screenings or fellow filmmakers who saw the short would often put a bug in my ear about about different ways that they saw it could go. I did actually try to implement those in a couple early drafts of the feature version of the script, but all of those avenues ended up being dead ends, mainly because they caused a problem with the structure when you started to elongate the story into the feature format. And so I knew I had to reverse engineer the outline, try to figure out what is the best way to still tell this. The one thing I was dead set on was that I still really wanted to retain the same tone and a lot of the same characters that we see in the short film. That was the soul of the film, whether on a smaller scale or on a larger scale. One of the nice things about doing the short was it became very clear to me what the world was after spending so many years developing the short, and even having time retrospectively after we had finished the short film. That really made it very clear to me what this world was, what the genre was, so that when we got into the feature version, it became very clear to me. I just had to figure out really where was the best place to expand the world and what was the most interesting part of the world that we wanted to explore next in this sandbox. Since the short really seemed to connect with audiences in such a powerful way, I really wanted to make sure that the feature did the same thing and we lived up to the spirit of the short film. Part 9, outlining and drafting the feature script. I usually take quite a bit of time to brainstorm a lot of different ideas, take a lot of notes in my notes app before I ever start the official outline of a feature script or a short. Usually for me, I have to let the ideas percolate for quite a long time and gestate in my head before the structure starts to come to me a little more fully formed in my brain. Only after that point do I feel ready to formally start the outline. So I took a few months to brainstorm and I entertained any idea that could possibly fit within the realm of the Cuddle Buddies feature, different ways we could show the future, or maybe we go to the past. And I'll admit that the overabundance of possibilities is what made refining it into the final outline so much more difficult. And it took me roughly a month of writing by hand the first iteration of the outline of how I saw the film. And this was all based off one of the conversations I had with an industry friend. And I really thought that the potential idea they pitched of where we could go, which was into the future and seeing Marina as an adult now and how she would handle her relationship to her parents and the divorce that we see in the short, how we pick up with her and her relationship to cuddling and intimacy, and if she actually does cuddling for work or not. So that plot line became the basis for the first outline I did. The major problem with this outline is that it basically put the film into a 2-act structure instead of the standard 3-act structure. I could not quite crack the code to find the way to tell this in 3 acts that felt elegant, but also still true to the story of what Cuddle Buddies was in a longer form. So essentially in this outline and this story version of Cuddle Buddies, the first act really followed Lucy as she was. We basically make the first half Lucy's story, and she's the protagonist. And then we have a big act break, and the whole second act of the film would be Marina's story, and we flash forward 20 or so years until now Marina is a young adult. She's figuring out her identity and what she wants to do for a living, and I had the idea that she actually becomes a cuddler herself, and this is a way to sort of reconnect with her mom. I also toyed around with the idea that she went the exact opposite and wanted nothing to do with intimacy, cuddling, or connection, and I figured that would be a dagger to Lucy, that she had this relationship with her daughter that was so close that we saw in the short, and now it's disintegrated and now they have to repair it. These ended up becoming different types of ideas that would have fit more of a different kind of family drama, but it started taking you further and further away from the soul of the cuddling, and the cuddling started to really lose out on having a voice in the story. So I knew that was not the film that I was trying to make. So you really have to dig in and ask yourself the tough questions of, is this actually the movie I want to make? So I spent about 8 months writing this first draft of the film, this version where we see Marina as an adult in the second act. And the very first draft of the film came out to a whopping 162 pages, way longer than what this indie character drama was supposed to really be. There was way too many loose threads. There was too much rambling. This needed some serious story changes to make this work on a feature scale structurally. One of the most difficult things about trying to make a 2 two-act film, especially in this context, was that we switched protagonists halfway through the movie. So what happens as an audience member is just as we're starting to invest in one protagonist and finally go along for the ride, we switch it up, and now our focus completely shifts to a different protagonist that we now have to follow. And that's a very difficult and risky demand to make of any audience. So really what I realized was I had to scrap the two-act structure and re-engineer my outline so that I could create the traditional three-act structure, which really would serve this film for the best. It's okay, in fact, it's essential sometimes to let go of certain scenes or characters that worked really well in the short film, but sometimes when you start to expand the story into a larger structure and footprint, those scenes just no longer have a place anymore. To think of this as almost an entirely different movie in some ways. One of the things I highly recommend as well is to show your script and your outlines, no matter what stage you're at, to different writers and different colleagues that you trust. And so at that time, I was in a writers group with two friends, Cameron Jackson and Frankie Camposano, workshopping each other's scripts, meeting about once a month. And the way that we would do it is we would meet in person and actually have a roundtable discussion and talk about the notes. And this served to be a much better way of getting feedback than just getting an email from somebody, because we could actually have that discussion. I could ask questions. One of the things that was crucial during this workshopping phase was they both really helped me figure out how to engineer the script to be a three-act structure from the two-act structure that it started with. We also really focused on Lucy's journey and sustaining the dramatic tension of her own internal conflict, and really showcase more of who she was as a character and as a person outside of just being a cuddler, since in the short film we really don't have much more time to establish that she's a mother and she's a cuddler and she's good at both of these things. I wanted her to have her own unique voice and her own internal battles, her own dramatic tension that we can focus on. What I really ended up defining for the feature version of the script was that this was basically the hero's journey, but about a cuddler, but also her own coming of age and becoming a mother, especially when she didn't think she wanted to be. The key to solving the structure of the feature version of Cuddle Buddies was realizing that to start the film, we actually needed to go back in time and rewind the whole timetable of when we first meet Lucy. When we first meet Lucy, she's in her early 20s. This is well before she becomes a cuddler. We could also establish how she discovers cuddling, and by proxy, the audience discovers it with her at the same time. And this became a perfect way to also introduce exposition of how the cuddling sessions work. She's a very fiery personality, very insistent that she doesn't want kids, doesn't like kids. I also knew that it would be much more interesting and entertaining to have Lucy almost fall into cuddling by accident and actively resist it at the beginning. That way, when she ends up becoming so good at it, we realize this was her destiny all along, but we also see and experience the full ride with her as an audience member so that we understand how she got to be this good at cuddling, and we very clearly establish what her wants and her needs are as a character. This idea really helped to reinforce the three-act structure, especially the first act in the way that we introduce Lucy and set up our world, but we also get to have our own version of the Karate Kid type montage, but for a cuddler, which I thought would be a very fun way to turn that trope on its head in a unique way. It's not only her finally giving in to her true destiny and she stops resisting what that really is, but it also really makes her realize that not only does she want to have kids, but she becomes a fantastic mother as a result. And again, this goes in opposition to everything she thought she knew at the very beginning of the film, but also that this is really Lucy's story and how she's transformed as a person by the end of the film. I'll admit that this revisions process was unbelievably grueling, especially for this specific script. Walking down all these different roads to realize they were dead ends, that made this the most interesting and compelling version of what the Cuddle Buddies feature would look like. So it's been over 2 years of writing the first draft and revisions just to get us to where we are now. The current draft is version 9, meaning 9 different revisions to get to where we are now. Make sure you do all of your revisions and really workshop and get a very polished script before you move into things like getting a budget made, getting a schedule made. This will also end up saving you a lot of time and money, since if your script really isn't pretty locked before you start doing production documents, you're going to end up having to redo those. And that's also going to unnecessarily add a lot of cost to your pre-production and development expenses. Part 10. The development phase: budgeting, scheduling, and preparing the pitch. I started to get serious about assembling all the materials that would eventually go into our pitch deck. This is one of the essential documents that helps you go out and pitch and sell your film with. But usually for a feature film pitch deck, there are a couple additional items that you want to include that really speak to more of the business side of filmmaking. Most pitch decks have some key elements that you need to include, including the script, the short film if you have a link, references to other similar films, including how they did at the box office and how much they cost to make and how much money they made back on the budget that they spent. For these references, you could also include the production and distribution companies if it feels relevant, any photos or references that help you showcase the visual language that you're trying to establish with the film. The financing strategy, which often includes how much equity investors will get back and how many points they'll receive on the back end, which just means how much money they get back depending on the performance of the film. Any actors that you have in the lead roles that you either already have formally attached or that you're going to pursue to try to make an offer for. Obviously, the actors that you put in there, whether you have them formally attached or not, you want to make sure that you have at least some that bring sales value, meaning they're popular, they're marketable, their name alone could help you get financing, and they have a fan base that's already pre-established. This is one of the key documents that you're constantly going to be sending out to different investors or production companies or agents or managers, etc. A great pitch deck makes it that much easier to get your film made and makes it that much more clear to anyone that you're taking a meeting with what's the vision of your film, why they should be a part of it, why they should invest in it, and shows that you've really done your market research and you understand where your film can fit in the actual marketplace. Some pitch decks will also include information about the director and a short bio and a list of other prior credits. It's very important to establish, whether in your verbal pitch or in your pitch deck, why you're the person to make this film and why you should make it now. Great pitches also establish why it's a good investment for anybody to put money into your film as an equity investor. Think about your film as a product and you think about who would actually come to see this, who would pay money to watch this movie. Then you can not only figure out your niche demographic, but you can also figure out the best angle to pitch your film with. Films still need to make money somehow. So I really encourage all up and coming filmmakers, even if you're writers, directors, actors, and you just want to be creative, always consider what's the marketing angle, what's the sales side of the project I'm making, how would I sell it if I had to? Putting together a great pitch deck can take months and months of research and looking at different actors, studying the market, and really figuring out where you would angle your film, maybe even what company you would target to try to make it with, or which streamer you could see it streaming on. And a lot of times in today's current landscape, I think it's actually a smart play to consider if your feature film should go direct to streaming and just get a streaming deal versus trying to actually do a theatrical release, since oftentimes the box office for these indie films, they don't have the budget for as good a marketing as the big studio films, but also if it doesn't do well at the box office, then it's a much bigger loss in profit than if you were to just put it on a streamer. Sometimes as the market shifts, you as a filmmaker and as a business person have to also be adaptable and shift with it. The hard truth is that certain films just won't sell in certain periods of time, whereas in a couple years, that film could be the very hottest type of film that would be bought right away for a much higher price, and constantly evaluate if your project fits that or if it doesn't. And it's also okay to pivot. If you need to think of another idea, sometimes that's a better way to go than sitting on one that's getting no traction for a number of years. This was a great education since I read indie financing books, I talked to different people who had made projects, really started to put me into a salesman type of mode and think like an indie producer, since I was determined to just figure out how to get this made no matter what it took. One of the other decisions I made peace with early on was that I really did see Cuddle Buddies more as a streaming type of film than one that would probably have a big box office release at the theater. I also realized it could be the unique type of film that I could see at a big festival like Sundance or South by Southwest. And in a perfect scenario, it could get into one of those, screen on a big screen to still celebrate it like a filmmaker would, but then also it could get bought and distributed for an even higher price because of the prestige that it added. So who knows, maybe that'll happen. We're still in development. To use an example, one of the films that I used as a comp reference in our pitch deck was the film Moonlight by Barry Jenkins. Not only did it have similar tonal themes about about identity and intimacy or lack thereof as Cuddle Buddies did, but it also had a similar budget number that we're looking at making our film for, somewhere in the $2 to $4 million range, and it did really well at the box office, and it won Best Picture at the Oscars. But it also showcased that this type of story does have a market, it can win awards, and it can be very profitable for everybody involved. That's also one thing I recommend, is put comp films in your pitch deck that have done well at the box office and not ones that have not done well at the box office. The other thing that really helps is if you have good visuals and really great graphic design in your pitch deck. That really helps legitimize the professionalism of your project and your pitch deck. I also collaborated on the pitch deck with a company called True Variety Films, who works a lot with development and budget creation and schedule creation and pitch deck creation. They really helped me incorporate some of the more professional and business elements into the pitch deck, since they had had a lot more experience with that than I had, especially as a first-time feature director. Part 11. Preliminary budgeting in the American film market. I started approaching different line producers and production management people who could help me put together a rough budget estimate so that I had a better idea of what our budget number would be based off the current version of the script. And that way, that's a number I could wrap my head around, which again would be another important document I could take into a pitch with. This number really improved the pitch, since we were able to actually take it around and say, this is how much money we need, even if it comes from multiple different investor sources. The way I found True Variety Films was I put a post on Facebook on an I Need a Producer page, and essentially I was asking if anyone could do a budget for me for about this range of film. I got a massive response of line producers who reached out, and True Variety really was the one that most closely aligned with the energy that I was looking for. So I went with them and I sent them the link to the short. And what was cool was on the next call that we had after they had a chance to watch the short, they were super interested, and they had a service where they represented films and pitched on the behalf of filmmakers at sales markets like the American film market. This number can drastically vary, but the standard rate to do a preliminary budget from a line producer for a feature film is usually anywhere from $1,500 to $5 or $6 grand or more. Usually it's a flat rate to put together that budget. The thing I learned though, and highly recommend, is if you can, try to get a little bit of seed funding or development money. Things like this preliminary budget or the pitch deck should really come out of this development fund and really not out of your pocket, especially if you're an indie filmmaker and you don't have a lot to work with. They also had a service where they represented a filmmaker and pitched on their behalf at the American film market, which is the biggest film market in North America. And this is a huge place of business where a lot of distribution deals, a lot of financing deals, a lot of films get greenlit and put together at these markets. So stay tuned for a future video where I will do a much deeper dive on film markets. So it really is one of those things where it takes a long time to get an indie film made. So if you have all these things ready to go, the best thing you can do is strike whenever the iron's hot. That wraps up the very last video in this Cuddle Buddy case study series. I sincerely hope you all enjoyed watching these videos as much as I did making them. Stay tuned for more updates on the development process for the Cuddle Buddies feature, but until then, Cuddle Buddies for life. If you want to continue on this journey with me, then definitely be sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe, make sure to comment below if you have any other topics you want to see covered, and I will do my best to make sure those are covered in a future video. Thank you so much for tuning in, and that concludes the 5-part case study series on the making of my short film, Cuddle Buddies. I want to appreciate you all so much again for tuning in, and I will definitely catch you next week.